We were scheduled to have Congressman Jared Huffman come and open the panel this afternoon, but the Hill, and the House side in particular, has a full day of votes. So it is with regret that he will not join us, but we have Piper Crowell as his legislative director who will speak on his behalf. I'd like to say quickly a word about Congressman Huffman. He represents the 2nd District of California, which stretches all the way from the Golden Gate Bridge to the Oregon border. And he is the only member of Congress that has the distinction of having 3 sanctuaries offshore from his district. And I can ask you if you could name them, but I'll give you Gulf of Fair Loans, Cordell Bank, and Monterey Bay. Congressman Huffman served before the House of Representatives as a California Assembly official, where he was a prodigious legislator. And before that, he served as a senior attorney for the Natural Resources Defense Council, where he was a prodigious litigator. So he's seen all sides of government, all 3 branches. He's now here in Washington, D.C., where he serves on the House Natural Resources Committee and the House Budget Committee. And we're delighted to have Piper Crowell in his stead.
Hi. Again, the Congressman sends his apologies for not being able to make it today. The House has called him to vote, and he asked me to read the following remarks on his behalf. My congressional district stretches along the California coast from the Golden Gate Bridge to the Oregon border. Those of you who have been there will understand why I say I represent the most beautiful congressional district in the country. We're dealing with stronger and more destructive storms and natural disasters than we've ever faced in American history, all while slashing funding for the agencies that are critical to helping our communities predict, adapt, and rebuild. Every day, it looks less likely that Congress will act to replace the sequester. This is an indiscriminate meat-axe cut that even slashes funding for the agencies that keep our shores safe and help us respond to natural disasters. NOAA will lose $271 million in funding in 2013, including at least $50 million for its geostationary weather satellite program, which continues to provide monitoring for severe weather. That's right, less than a year after Hurricane Sandy, we're cutting the agency responsible for forecasting and monitoring hurricanes. But it's not just natural disasters on our shores that affect Americans. My congressional district has seen debris from the 2011 Japanese tsunami wash up on our shores, and our regional economy is inextricably tied to the health of the ocean and the coast. We need congressional action to help forestall climate change and protect our coastal communities, and we need it now. But the political reality is that it's going to be incredibly difficult to move good environmental legislation through Congress in the near future. In the Natural Resources Committee, we've had hearing after hearing about the wonders of offshore drilling. This week, we'll be considering yet another bill to open up the Atlantic and Pacific coasts and sensitive areas off of Alaska to oil and natural gas drilling, without putting in place the recommended key safety reforms following the BP Deepwater Horizon disaster in the Gulf of Mexico. The good news is that most bills like this won't be signed into law, but it dominates the agenda in the House, and these partisan divisions make it difficult to do good environmental work. I'm an optimist. I think we can move strong environmental policy, but it will take hard work and creativity. We are going to have to be smart to move policies forward by working directly with the Obama administration in areas where there is executive authority to do good things. For example, we are finally moving forward on national ocean policy. This document is a comprehensive, proactive approach anchored in sound science. In this new era of austerity and sequestration, agencies are going to need to work together even more closely than before. And this plan is an important step in making sure we use our resources efficiently to protect our waters and the communities that rely on them. Fittingly, our next panel will explain to you exactly how we're going to do that. Again, I apologize for the congressman not being able to make it, but thank you all for the work you guys are doing.
Thank you, Piper. So now I'd like to introduce the moderator for the next panel, Braxton Davis. Mr. Davis is the director of the North Carolina Division of Coastal Management, and in that role he oversees the state's coastal planning, coastal permitting, and coastal reserve programs. Formerly, he was the chair of the Coastal States Organization based here in Washington, D.C., and he's currently chairing a multi-state committee on beach and inlet issues. He's also worked for the state of South Carolina, and he's got 3 different universities under his belt, from the University of Florida, University of Virginia, Florida International University, and the University of Rhode Island. So a very solid pedigree in some of the best coastal and ocean universities in the country. With that, Braxton.
Thank you, Jason. Good afternoon, everyone. It's been good to catch up with a lot of old friends in the audience today, some that were my age as well. Yes, didn't drink any coffee in the breakout. This panel's been asked to talk about the federal service and the federal role in coastal hazards and resilience. And so you're going to hear slightly different perspectives than what you've heard maybe on similar questions that we've been talking about all day today. Obviously, a lot of different federal agencies play a role in coastal hazards and coastal resilience. We have FEMA, NOAA, Coast Guard, USGS, Army Corps, and many others. And so we're gonna hear from these folks, and I think you're gonna hear a repeating theme from them, and especially in terms of recent experience and growing experience, is that the theme I think you're gonna hear is cooperation at levels that we haven't seen in the past, and that it's really improving. And so you're going to hear examples of that, and then try to figure out what we need to do going forward. This is a fantastic panel that I'm very honored to be a part of today. We have some heavy hitters up here. So I'm going to go ahead and give you a brief bio for the folks on this panel, since you have the full bios in your packets. We first have Joellen Darcy. She is the Assistant Secretary of the Army for the Civil Works Program of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. In that role, she provides direction and supervision for all of the Army Corps' functions relating to the Civil Works Program, including reimbursable work performed on behalf of federal and non-federal entities. Let's see, she's also worked on water resource and transportation issues in the past for Governor Jim Blanchard of Michigan, so she has a lot of good state experience as well. And so we're going to enjoy hearing from her. We have Darren Babb-Brott, who serves as the director of the National Ocean Council. Darren also has 22 years of experience in coastal and ocean management with a focus on working waterfronts, infrastructure development, and environmental impact review. He served formerly as the Assistant Secretary for Ocean and Coastal Zone Management in Massachusetts, and certainly has a wonderful reputation in the coastal zone management community. He's from Maine, where he grew up working on the water, and had a BA in Government Environmental Studies from Bowdoin. I'm sorry, I'm going to say that wrong. Is it Bowdoin?
Close enough, Bowdoin.
Close enough, okay. College. He lives in Massachusetts with his wife and 2 daughters. We have Sandy Esslinger, who's a coastal resiliency policy advisor with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Prior to joining NOAA's Coastal Services Center, she was with the Department of Defense, where she led long-range planning, infrastructure development, and risk management programs. She also has a strong background in community planning and hazard resilience work at the state and local levels, where I met her from my days in South Carolina. She's recently been on assignment from NOAA to work on coastal resilience-related efforts and interagency efforts in relation to Superstorm Sandy, so she's going to bring a lot of experience from that as well. And we have Wendy Weber. Wendy was appointed as the Northeast Regional Director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in 2011. In that role, she oversees service activities in 13 states from Maine to Virginia and the District of Columbia, leading more than 1,000 service employees, working in more than 130 field offices, and including 72 refuges that encompass more than 500,000 acres. So she has a vast degree of experience, originally from Rochester, New York. She has a bachelor's degree in zoology from the University of Rhode Island and a master's degree in fisheries from the University of Georgia. So I want to get to them as quickly as possible because of the incredible experience they bring on these subjects. I don't know why they asked a state guy to lead this federal service panel, but I certainly come at this from my experiences with the Coastal States Organization, South Carolina, and now North Carolina. I'm certainly going to bring a little bit of a state slant to this. A key theme for me, I think, is that each individual state, the 35 coastal states and territories, have each evolved a very different set of policies and programs around coastal hazards. Each also faces slightly different types of hazards and different risks. The diversity across the coastal states and territories was recognized by Congress back in the late 60s and then in the passage of the Federal Coastal Zone Management Act in 1972, and really embracing the concept of the individual states as laboratories and developing the best practices around different issues, including coastal hazards. The North Carolina Coastal Management Program that I'm a part of where I'm headquartered out of Morehead City, North Carolina. Our program is involved in a wide variety of activities, including permitting, planning, research, education, and outreach activities, all related, or in many cases related to coastal resilience in different ways. We play a significant role in hurricane recovery and redevelopment, development planning and permitting in special coastal hazard zones, management of shoreline stabilization and engineering activities for the state. We're engaged in sub-regional beach and inlet management planning. We work and coordinate with the Corps of Engineers and other federal and state agency reviews for larger scale coastal projects. And we do all sorts of training and technical assistance and workshops for a big variety of local governments and stakeholder groups along the coast. When I see the news coming out of the other coastal states and territories and the coastal management programs that I follow, I'm always impressed with what they're doing on coastal hazards. They do a lot of very similar types of things to what we're doing in North Carolina and my experiences in South Carolina. So they're great programs for this. The National Ocean Policy and the recent establishment of regional ocean partnerships nationwide is certainly a very positive and increasing collaborations among state and federal agencies on issues of shared regional concerns and priorities. Our experience in the Southeast with the newly emerging Governor's South Atlantic Alliance, we have state and federal agencies in the Southeast that are working with academic and NGO partners on a variety of things related to hazards, like setting up regional data layers and data sharing arrangements, comparing how we're doing different types of hazard vulnerability mapping and shoreline change analysis. And we've had a recent regional summit on long-term recovery planning. Those types of increased collaborations around hazard issues are increasing the capacities of each individual state as they go forward, and I think they're matched well with the differing needs of each state in the region. I do want to say that regional efforts that we're all very excited about, the regional data sets, the regional assessments and tools and products, they're not always going to hit at that local level. And again, the panel's being asked to talk about the federal service and how to engage coastal communities. I think that they're not always going to hit the ground level at the right spatial resolution or at the right timing with the evolution of policies and even the right venues at times. So I think what I wanted to highlight very briefly here is the importance of the existing federal-state partnership programs that we already have in place. This kind of echoes some of the sentiments of the earlier panelists. We have coastal management programs at the state level that are partnered with NOAA. We have sea grant programs. We have hazard mitigation programs with FEMA. These are trusted people, usually, who have really strong existing relationships with the coastal communities. They have an in-depth knowledge of the local issues and needs and risks and hazard vulnerabilities. And it's a relatively small grouping of state leaders in every single state and territory who are at the center of very significant issues and representing a lot of coastal interests. And so they need all the support they can get. So I guess my thought on this panel in terms of the new paradigm of federal service and in communicating with coastal communities is that I think we need to more systematically engage the individual states as well as the regions. Federal-state partnership programs that we've had for a long time, like the CZ programs, the state hazard mitigation programs, sea grant programs, and others, to see what is each state doing individually. What are they not doing? What are they doing well? And then trying to align the federal resources around the unique circumstances and programs and policies of each state. as well as supporting linkages between the stovepipes of those programs at the state level. I think that's another thing we can really do better at. I don't think it always works well for federal agencies to try to work directly at the community levels or to assume that you're going to get a lot of local community level results out of regional activities alone. Much like the National Ocean Policy and the Regional Ocean Partnerships, which are gaining momentum, I think that a renewed focus on the state-level partner programs and their role in coastal resilience will help achieve financial efficiencies. I think we can look at permit streamlining and mutual benefits out of this, and I think better outcomes on the ground. I think the National Ocean Council is heading great directions on this and trying to align federal activities and bringing technical resources to bear at the state and local levels, and they have a great person at the helm to get that done in Deeren. So with that, I will conclude my opening remarks to the panel and hand off to Joellen to start us off. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Afternoon, everybody. It's after lunch and before happy hour, so you're all awake, so that's a good thing. I thank you for inviting me to be here today, and I think one of the things I'd like to talk about as far as resilience and our coastal zones is concerned is what the Army Corps of Engineers does, and in particular what we did in response to Hurricane Sandy. The Army Corps of Engineers has many responsibilities and missions, and when it comes to natural disasters, we are responders to missions assigned to us from FEMA. One of the missions that we have as a result of our federal disaster framework with FEMA is to do infrastructure and infrastructure response. What we did in response to Hurricane Sandy was unprecedented, not only because of the superstorm, but also because of what the Corps of Engineers was called upon to do. We did things that we never had to do before, and I learned things that I never knew before. I didn't know that there was a difference between dewatering and unwatering, but there is a difference. What we did in Manhattan and in other places within New York and New Jersey was we unwatered 14 different areas that were identified by the states and the municipalities to unwater. And what unwater means is you take water from a place where there was never supposed to be water, like a tunnel in Manhattan. If you dewater, you take too much water out of a place where there is supposed to be water. It's a distinction that was very important to us in trying to figure out how to get unwater all of those subway stations and all those tunnels under the city of Manhattan. We had 475 million gallons of water that we took out of that. That's about 720 Olympic-sized swimming pools. We did it in the New York City subway system. We unwatered a Passaic water treatment plant in New Jersey, and we restored the operation of the Hoboken terminal in New Jersey, just to mention a couple of things. It was a storm of unprecedented volumes and surges. We operated 162 pumps. We refurbished 115 transitional housing units. We removed 693,855 cubic yards of debris. And we assessed over 1,765 properties in addition for debris removal just on Fire Island alone. It was an incredible task. I couldn't be more proud of the agency that I represent here today. And that was just our response action. We also now are in the process of doing recovery, both in New York and New Jersey. The Congress, as many of you know, authorized a supplemental appropriations bill to help deal with the impacts from Hurricane Sandy. Several billion dollars worth of funding. The Army Corps of Engineers got about $5 billion. We are charged with a number of things to be responsible for that money. One of them is a construction fund in order to build or rebuild or reassess some of the projects that we had ongoing or were under consideration, not only in New York and New Jersey, but within the reach of the storm. We have directed about $850 million in what's called our Federal Coastal and Coastal Emergency Account. This money will be used and is being used to repair some of the damage to some of the projects that we had. What we're looking at, we've submitted 2 reports to Congress that were required by that legislation. The third is making its way to the Hill, hopefully within the next week or so. But one of the biggest things that I think is going to be a positive result out of an unfortunate situation is that the Congress directed us to spend $20 million on a comprehensive study on flood risks in the coastal zone. And that coastal zone, as defined by the Congress, will take from our North Atlantic Division. The Army Corps of Engineers is divided by districts and divisions. We have 38 districts that have civil works projects. We have 8 divisions. Our North Atlantic Division is being tasked with doing this comprehensive study, and that division goes from Norfolk all the way up the coast of Maine to Canada. So that within that division, within that geographic footprint, is what the Army Corps of Engineers is going to look at as far as looking to the future of what makes sense for us to be building, what makes sense for us to be studying, and what makes sense for us, and I'm saying us, meaning us as a nation, to be able to combat the future storms, because Sandy's just the beginning. We are going to see, I think, more aggressive and stronger weather patterns in the years to come, and we need to be not only prepared for it, but be able to be resilient in what it is we consider in building. What we're doing also, this we were doing before Sandy, but in our planning process within the Army Corps of Engineers, we are looking at sea level rise and as well as climate change in all of our planning. There's projections that within 10 to 20 years, the sea level rise on the coast of New York and New Jersey is going to be in feet, not inches. And so that is what we need to consider when we're developing our plans for the future. So I think, as I say, if out of a tragedy you can make an opportunity, I think we as a nation can be looking at how it is we are going to either build or move in response to what it is we can anticipate and what's coming in future storms, as well as what's going to be what our coast is going to look like in the future. And with that, I'll stop and let someone else talk.
Kieran?
Great, thank you. So after so much time in the state, when Braxton opens with that kind of thing, I really have to restrain myself from just sort of jumping up and saying, you know, that's it. You know, you nailed it. It's good. States are where it's at. The delivery systems are there. We're good to go. And I've brought that perspective down here as part of the National Ocean Council, and having the opportunity now to work with federal agencies in finalizing the implementation plan and now moving out and starting to get after implementation actions. One of the other pieces that's been really important and really gratifying about that is that, you know, I now have had the opportunity to, working with federal colleagues, come to develop a much greater appreciation for the level of commitment, for the expertise, and for the experience that resides on the federal side of the ledger. And the importance now of, as Braxton started to talk about, marrying those two capacities in a way that addresses the kinds of issues that are so important, and that some of which we're here to talk about today. So a really key piece of this is not to reinvent the wheel, not to develop shiny new things for the sake of doing so, but to marry the capacities and the knowledge that is required on both sides, overarching, broad, federal knowledge, science, and management issues with state expertise, state ability to speak the dialect of the particular place that's facing a challenge, and that where those relationships have been developed in order to do so. So that's kind of the theme of what I've got going here, and I wanted to start by just saying that addressing the theme of the discussion overall, the new paradigm for federal service, and in this case engaging coastal communities and building resilience, has really been a hallmark of this administration across a number of issues, right? In this instance, it's a new paradigm for federal service in engaging coastal communities and resilience, but it applies across the board and could be touched on in those different ways, right? And the hallmarks of the administration's approach has been based on a foundation of science and information, the coordination of agencies and their work, partnerships with states, tribes, stakeholders, and communities of practice to develop solutions. So pick an area, pick an issue, pick a place, and that's been the approach. The National Ocean Policy itself, as Braxton alluded, is an example of exactly that, and it is explicitly an endorsement of that approach. I mean, it's based on that, right? The policy says, essentially, to secure through our stewardship all of the many benefits the ocean provides, do the following things. Among those explicitly are improve the resilience of ocean, coastal, and Great Lakes ecosystems, communities, and economies, and, among other things, use science and information, develop new tools to do that is the foundation of the work. Do all of that by developing a collaborative framework that facilitates cohesive actions across the federal government with state, tribal, local authorities, regional governance structures, NGOs, the public and the private sector, right? Figure out what's important, understand the science behind it, understand what people need, put the two together, and move forward. So implementation of the policy is based on developing services, tools, and products, and on supporting local and regional actions. One of the important components of the implementation plan building off the policy is that what the National Ocean Policy through the implementation plan does is not necessarily new action on the part of the agencies, right? What it does do is take actions that agencies were working on in their different components, and somebody, I think you mentioned, or maybe it was Braxton, stovepipes. It was a meeting last week, and I heard somebody complain about the term stovepipes. Said they're not stovepipes, they're cylinders of excellence. Which, right? So, stepping outside our cylinders of excellence, working together, and building those pieces going forward. So the NOP essentially says, look at the things that you already had on the books and that you were committed to doing under your existing authorities and missions. Figure out how to do them better and see and understand the interconnections with your colleagues and the issues that they're trying to address in similar things. Put your efforts together and then identify the actions specifically that you will take going forward to do so. Right? So the implementation, that's the new thing the implementation plan does in large regard. It doesn't invent a new program of work for the agencies. It asks the agencies to formally collaborate, coordinate in establishing explicit tools, products, and services going forward, and to commit to timelines associated with doing so. So I'll touch on this again at the end, but I think one of the remarkable things about the IP is that for the first time, at least in this realm, to me anyway, it's the first time that there has been published essentially a catalog of federal agency actions that address ocean-related issues. That's a tremendously valuable and important thing. And I'm going to come back to, that's the thing people should think about and people could use as you ask the question, how do we do this better and where are we going with this paradigm, right? It is a source of raw material, and regions and states specifically have the opportunity to look at that, not think about the ocean policy in terms of what it is and what it does, but what it represents in terms of capacity and resources, and have states be able to look at that and leverage what they want out of that. So when I end up, I'm going to ask, what do you guys think about the National Ocean Policy and implementation actions is specific to resilience, because that's where the conversation ought to go, I think. So, for example, the National Ocean Policy includes actions like develop and disseminate methods, best practices, and standards for assessing the resilience of natural resources, cultural resources, populations, and infrastructure in a changing climate. That will be undertaken initially in 2013 by DOI, NOAA, EPA, FEMA, and DOT. Right? There's a specific thing. It's not something that was invented. It was the agencies working on components of that, which they are now doing collectively in a way that is directly intended to be responsive to the interests we're talking about here. Develop and disseminate a suite of regional climate projections for coastal and marine regions of the United States. The Global Change Research Program and NOAA, same kind of thing. You can talk about sea level +1 or LIDAR as specific technical aspects. There are tools that are out there that are part of agencies' portfolios now baked into something that is intended specifically to address in a more collective approach the kinds of things that regions are interested in doing. So I guess the only other piece that I wanted to add was in some of our run-up conversations, Braxton had talked about the need for the kind of systematic engagement of states as delivery vehicles. Also acknowledging that tribes, NGOs, the private sector, players outside state and federal government have unique perspectives, they have unique expertise, experience, and the ability to attack problems from different angles. In a lot of ways, those are all kind of wrapped up in what states can do because states experience all of those and collate those resources and perspectives as part of their own working on issues and translating those up to regional or federal resources. But it's important to keep in mind that there are many more than two perspectives at play here. So lastly, I guess to close, I'd say to answer the question directly on point, to address coastal communities' issues, states and regions have the opportunity and the ability to channel local needs, local perspectives, and the opportunity to leverage the National Ocean Council to use the implementation plan as a source of raw materials. There's a huge value either through, if a region is doing marine planning or regional ocean partnerships, other state and regional pieces, for states to communicate up what the perspective on the ground is and what the needs are, and to be able to channel those in a way that makes it easier for the federal agencies to meet them halfway and get after the needs that are out there. So, thanks, Braxton.
Sandy?
Thank you very much. Just to kind of build on the two previous speakers, I'd like to talk a little bit about the connections on the federal side to the state and local communities that have been experienced in post-Hurricane Sandy. And as part of NOAA, working for NOAA's Coastal Services Center, I've had the privilege of working with state coastal programs throughout the country over a number of years. And I know one of the topics that continuously come up in these partnerships with state coastal programs and their local counterparts has been this issue of resilience and the capacity building that goes along with that. So the organization that I work for really has focused on helping to build capacity amongst the state agencies and for them to help build the capacities at the local level based on whatever is existing within their own state framework. And because we kind of have worked in that arena for a number of years, we're familiar with the fact that each state handles these things a little bit differently. Each state, has a certain political environment they've got to work within, as well as their existing realities associated with the hazards that they face and how maybe where they are in the capacity building arena. So based on that and the fact that we'd had some of these experiences and working with planning in these state coastal programs, we kind of knew going in post-Sandy that there were a number of things that we wanted to focus on as we were invited in to be part of the National Disaster Recovery Framework. So representing NOAA, they pulled in some resources in both New York and New Jersey that had this coastal management experience, that had the ability to kind of come in, hit the ground running with existing networks. And I think when we start talking about cooperation being a key, one of the things that I like to hit on is it doesn't happen by magic, and it especially doesn't happen magically because a disaster just hit you. Really, it happens because you've already got some networks in place that you're able to draw from, and you're able to kind of build on that capacity. So the various things that have been talked about with the regional ocean policy, absolutely the networks that were in place amongst the states in the region that was hit by Hurricane Sandy has been incredibly instrumental in putting the effort necessary to do the recovery planning and putting some recovery activities in place on the ground. Another thing to kind of highlight is the fact that those existing partnerships really serve as a foundation for the implementation strategies. And in this National Disaster Recovery Framework, this was really the first time it was implemented on a national, large-scale kind of national level disaster. It's a new framework, and a lot of what's going on that we've heard previous panelists talk about is really in the area of the planning for it, how to kind of get those networks in place, how to get those partnerships working. And we didn't have that benefit in New York and New Jersey, and I'm particularly worked in New York, but also a little in New Jersey. So we were just kind of there, a lot of agency representatives that kind of were learning what the NDRF was and how to actually implement it and trying to build on our existing experiences to be able to make it work. And I think that there have been a lot of successes because they pulled in people that had that ability to kind of do that. But what I will say is that the framework itself is really meant to bring agencies together and work in a way that maybe they haven't worked, federal agencies, that they haven't worked before. So there have been, I won't lie to you, there have been some real challenges. I think there are going to be a lot of after-action things that we can learn from. But the reality is it was a real success story in terms of being able to get agencies like the Corps of Engineers and FEMA and NOAA and a number of other agencies. DOI has played a major role in this particular recovery effort. And it was the first time on a national scale that we felt like we were very successful in pulling in coastal issues and coastal programs into being a major player in leading a lot of the recovery activities. I know that coastal programs do play a major role in after post-disasters on a regular basis, but I think one of the things that we've heard over and over again post-Katrina and in North Carolina and in Florida after various hurricanes is that the coastal programs wanted they wanted more of a seat at the table to talk about the bigger issues, to talk about the integration of issues. And that's been on the state's agendas for a number of years. And in this particular case, particularly in New York, because we were working on capacity building in the area of resilience, in the area of climate adaptation, and in the area of coastal and waterfront development and redevelopment activities, the coastal program did take a major role in the recovery activities. They took a very front and center role at the state level. They've been a major player at the state table from the very beginning. They've benefited from a number of the things that were talked about earlier, the programs that have been improved on over time, where you're able to look at using some of that funding a bit differently than you have in the past. And the state coastal program was able to, like I said, take a major leadership role in now looking at long-term recovery and coastal community recovery through what they're calling coastal reconstruction zones and the planning for that. That includes hazard, risk, and vulnerability assessment and planning and implementation rebuilding processes that include current risk as well as future risk. They include a lot of the coastal issues that, such as erosion and other issues and hazards, as well as the inundation and current and future flood risk. So we're very excited at seeing the progress that the state is making in the implementation of their recovery activities, and feel very proud that not only was NOAA able to take a role in helping to kind of bring that agenda to the forefront, but helping to bring our federal agency partners to the table and be a part of that effort and help to find ways to really support that activity. So that just kind of goes along with this idea of what can the federal government do, what can agencies do to really improve capacity, and we truly believe that the opportunity to do so through working with state programs and helping to meet their agendas for meeting long-term resilience is a big part of what we want to do.
Great. Thank you, Sandy. Wendy?
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is a bureau within the Department of Interior, and there's many bureaus within the department. You've probably heard of the U.S. Geological Survey, as well as the Bureau of Indian Affairs and Bureau of Ocean and Energy Management, the Bureau of Safety and Environment Enforcement, the National Park Service. All of those bureaus have had integral roles in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy or Superstorm Sandy. But I'm going to primarily focus on the Fish and Wildlife Service, and primarily in the Northeast region, where Fish and Wildlife Service is a field-based organization. And so we have folks throughout the various states and our various offices that are there to provide technical expertise in various conservation efforts, as well as national wildlife refuges that are our own federal lands that provide really good, crucial habitat for wildlife and fish. And our mission of the Fish and Wildlife Service is to conserve, enhance, protect fish, wildlife, and their habitats that they rely on for the benefit of the American people, and not only for this generation, for generations to come. So our role has been primarily looking at ecosystem services or on-the-ground conservation efforts as they not only contribute to wildlife and to fish and their habitats, but also to the services they provide. And I can say we are looking at larger landscape scales, and we're working. We can't do it without working in partnership, not only with the federal agencies, as mentioned, and the state agencies, but also at local levels. We are working at local levels and with non-governmental organizations. We have many granting programs, and it's clear that we have to work not only for good government, but good synergy and really leveraging each other's dollars at these various scales and looking at how we can build a more resilient future. So we're trying to rely on the best science, and as mentioned throughout the day, it was nice listening to the various discussions today, and what's really coming through for me also is the importance of sharing information and not duplicating the science and making sure it's in a readily available format that is translatable to all of us that are using it at our various scales and various levels. And so we're working really hard through different collaboratives, for instance, the Northeast Regional Ocean Council or Landscape Conservation Cooperatives or USGS's climate science centers. There's so many collaboratives that's important for us to participate in and be able to share this information and do planning together on these larger landscapes and include all the right people, the publics as well as the other entities, to ensure that we're doing things in the most strategic and right approach. So I really appreciate this panel today, and I really enjoyed listening to the discussions today to better help understand how we are going to build a more resilient future without duplicating efforts and being as resourceful as we can with our limited budgets and resources. So I look forward to the discussion today.
Great. Thank you very much. I guess I don't have any cards yet, so I will open up with a question for the panel. We've had some similar questions in earlier panels today, so it'll be interesting to get your all's perspectives on these. But I guess drawing on your experience here, we've heard a lot of good news and a lot of good coordination, and things are certainly improving. But what can we do? What more can we do to get toward this long-term increase in improvement in resilience versus the event response kind of model? How do you get into the state delivery mechanisms earlier, and how do you help coordinate across coastal zone management and hazard mitigation and the various programs and players at those state and local levels? How do you do that more routinely and get engaged? Who wants to take it?
I'm happy to start. So just being able to identify some existing programs that already are working at the levels and working with the partners that were impacted in post-Hurricane Sandy, but knowing that those programs exist and are being utilized throughout the country. So one example I would highlight is the I hope I get the name right, but Partnership for Sustainable Communities that involves EPA and HUD and Department of Transportation. There are also some kind of similar partnerships around smart growth and sustainability that EPA has with FEMA as well as with NOAA. And those programs, in fact, I know one of them is a major effort that's funding some of the activities that are going on in South Florida that were mentioned in the previous panel. But those partnerships are kind of building the foundation and building toward adaptation and resilience goals and developing networks that are going to be able to go on, once you are impacted by an event. So really thinking about how our existing programs might be tweaked or modified a bit to hit some of these goals, I think it could be a real asset and benefit to the federal structure. As we move forward. And I think continuing to support those and get the constituency supporting those would be really important.
Any other comments on that?
We just we have on-the-ground programs that are focused on emergency response, and we have them with states. We have this program that we work on called Silver Jackets. And we have Silver Jackets programs in 38 of the states, and we're hoping to get all 50 states. And what it is we work with the local governments as well as state emergency responders. And not only is it training, but it's also some exercises in advance of responding. I tried to figure out why they're called Silver Jackets, but Corps of Engineers emergency response jackets are red and FEMA's are blue, so I think we came up with silver. It's just sort of this is our new response mode. And it's been really effective. It started before Katrina, actually, but now we've got all 38 of 50 states involved in this program, and it's worked really well.
I had just joined the Silver Jackets before leaving South Carolina. It was a very good group. Yes, Wendy.
So the Department of Interior received approximately $830 million from the supplemental. And not only is some of it's going to various amounts are going to the various bureaus to do after storm efforts, but we're also going to compete approximately 100 million of that. And the idea is to do more of that leveraging, working with private state partners on the ground and looking at where we can leverage activities together on a landscape scale. So about half of that, or about close to 400 million of that, is going to recovery and response due to damaged infrastructure or damages to assets on the ground, and looking at ways to either rebuild differently, better, stronger, smarter, as we've heard earlier. Another will be to look at how to build a more resilient future. How are we going to change habitats on the landscape to better absorb or protect from future storm events. And so we're also looking at landscape level scale with our various partners with some of those funds to also look what we can do for those ecosystem services. I had the benefit of flying over basically from Massachusetts to North Carolina right after Hurricane Sandy occurred. And it was remarkable. We flew at a really low level, and it was remarkable to see that coastline and where you had intact ecosystems and you had infrastructure set behind that, how well Mother Nature was able to absorb that storm energy and how protective the intact systems played in that. And so it was clear to me, just flying and my personal observation of the importance of those intact ecosystems as far as being protection against not only natural, for natural resources, but for the social, cultural, economic aspects as well.
Okay, great. Okay, let's move to the first audience question here, and this first question starts with a comment and then leads into a question, so I'll read the comment. Land use has traditionally been a local agency responsibility, yet for not quite 100 years we have expected the feds to restore private property after disasters. So the question here is, what role should the feds have with respect to private property and reimbursing property owners as we start to talk about coastal managed retreat and other related issues? I certainly think it raises an important question about things we've heard today, and I think a lot of folks recognize that regulation alone, setbacks alone, probably won't get you there, and there's a question there about shared responsibility and cost sharing. So what are y'all's thoughts on the role of the federal government and opportunities for longer-term financial mechanisms to be in place to give folks options in the aftermath of a storm, and what is the appropriate federal role? That's a more political question, so we'll turn to Darren on that.
No way. I'll give you the state guy answer.
Yeah. Anyone take it. Why don't we talk about it in terms of what opportunities are there, rather the appropriateness of the federal role is a more political question probably, but in terms of opportunities there, I know I can give you one example. I know there's a history with the National Flood Insurance Program where at times the program has been able to reimburse or do a payout when there's a house that's out on a beach and exposed and has been underwashed due to erosion. I think the current practice is that they're not allowed to get a payout. There was a Upton-Jones Act that related to this, but when there sometimes are folks who want to take another option and could use some financial assistance to get over the hump to make that decision, what kinds of programs are out there, and especially in terms of what we've seen after Sandy and Katrina?
So I would just say maybe not so much on specific programs, but I know there are some out there, and I think what we are seeing in post-Sandy are some innovative ways to come up with options for how to promote different types of land use or different types of reconstruction actions. So I know that there are going to be some really nice, hopefully, best practices or promising practices that are going to come out of this disaster that we're going to want to pay a lot of attention to and emphasize. Kind of going back to what role should the feds have, I can't answer that obviously as a Fed, but what I can say is that there are options and opportunities for us to pay attention to things at different scales, and maybe some of the natural resource alternatives that you have to be looking at on a larger scale than an individual property by property perspective. And I think where the federal family can come together maybe is in how we look at some of these regional approaches to things, and how we look at things like green infrastructure and trying to build that into some of the alternatives that exist could be a really promising opportunity for the feds to get involved.
One thing that, as a result of Sandy, the President has established a Hurricane Sandy Recovery Task Force that is chaired by Secretary Donovan, the head of Housing and Urban Development. I sit on that task force, and this task force has been asked by the President to come up by August 2nd with a report to the president with recommendations just like you have outlined. What should the federal role be in these kinds of disaster responses? Does it make sense for example, for a CDBG grant to be given over and over again to rebuild in the same place to the same specifications without any sort of incentive or any kind of restrictions or regulations as to how that building should be built or where it should be built? And we're looking at those kind of recommendations for this August 2nd report, and it's the entire federal family. It's how does the housing grant program fit with the flood insurance program, fit with where the Army Corps of Engineers is planning to build a new construction project or build a coastal storm reduction project. And what we're doing as part of this report is we're looking at where each of the federal agencies is, and again, this is in Hurricane Sandy geographically specific, but I think we can learn some lessons for nationwide. But we're looking at what programs and what projects are currently in existence in that footprint and overlapping those programs on top of each other so we can see where there is, if there is duplication, should there be, and if there and what programs that currently are effective and ones that maybe aren't so effective and ones that could be revised in response to this disaster. So we expect that report on August 2nd from the task force.
Yeah, I think the outcome of that report and of the work that's occurring there is going to have a tremendous impact. I mean, in a lot of ways, it's the first time that this has really been addressed head on because it had to be, and it's been addressed head on in a place that effectively created a safe space for what are otherwise sometimes not safe kinds of conversations, recognizing that the imperative of getting something done and the fact that doing so is going to require a new approach, and considering developing specifics around and implementing the kinds of things that have previously been more on the cusp of or on the margins of policy discussions about appropriate or practicable actions by federal agencies. This is going to put those in a place where there is a desire and a direction to put those together and move those forward. So yeah, I think tipping point, and I think the results coming out of that are important. I'd add so if that's at a more macro scale. Every state has a place that gets whacked all the time, and the dynamics are the same across the board. In Massachusetts, I've been staying in touch with friends up there, and there's a place called Plum Island. People may know it. It's up on the northern coast, and it's every time a northeaster rolls through, it just gets pounded, and the same homes get pounded, and some of them fall in, and then the pitchforks and nooses come out. It's like I will rebel as God is my witness kind of stuff, and people are at their wits' end. But a couple of things are happening. One is a recognition that the significance and the repetitiveness of the actions are actually starting to drive some people to stop and think. People who are part of that kind of very local fabric of the community, who are otherwise going to be inclined to support their neighbor's interest, to respect the sort of cultural tradition of having the place on the water as opposed to maybe stopping and thinking more clinically about it. Stopping and looking and saying, maybe some more information would be helpful here because something's going on. And reaching out and asking for the kinds of more broad-based science that is going to help educate folks and illustrate, here's what's going to happen in 5 years. Here are the projections in 20 years. And so let's start having a conversation about that. On Plum Island, at least, and I think in other places, the conversation is advancing in a way that it hasn't a little bit before. And now tying this back to where I come from, part of what the ocean policy does is, and I would say that this is a significant benefit that feeds back into at a micro scale what states can do to start looking at that. Getting away from event response dynamics by creating and providing the science and information that allows the Plum Islands or allows the Sandy task forces to think intelligently, locally, and specifically about what are the kinds of scenarios that they need to be thinking about, and how does that inform what happens next.
Great. Okay, next question. We heard a discussion earlier about the importance of, or the role of uncertainty in all of this. This question is, given the interconnections between the principles of national ocean policy and coastal resilience, what would you recommend as reasonable planning time horizons for states and regions that are developing coastal hazards related plans, and how does uncertainty play a role in that?
So I think we can take actions immediately, absolutely, but some of these are experimental, and I think core to whatever we're doing on the coast or whatever we're doing in any area to build a more resilient future is to monitor. and then adapt. And so I heard it earlier, we don't want to be paralyzed by uncertainty. We're going to have to take action, and we have a lot of good information now, and those science gaps we'll have to keep working towards. So you have different windows, but there's plenty that we can be doing now to take action immediately. And a great example is, for aquatic connectivity, important for fish passage and what our interests are, but also really important for flood mitigation and ensuring that we replace culverts, to be sized for the predicted future. And there's so many actions that we can take that will protect the economy and the populations that reside in those areas with the information that we have now. But certainly, I think there's going to be some lessons learned. And as we're rebuilding some of these areas, there's going to be another storm that hits that pushes us back a little ways, and then we're going to have to rebuild again. And these are really hard decisions, and these are really hard policy calls, especially for us talking about what's the interim importance of some of these habitats. They may be gone in 20, 50, 70 years, but are they playing a really important role right now, worth investing into, at least so they can play that important interim role? So what is the cost versus the investment? And those are big policy calls for us.
And I would say a couple of things. One is looking at your infrastructure and investments and things where you've got a lower risk tolerance, to maybe be looking out at a planning horizon that's a little bit longer than you might be looking at in terms of near-term construction types of activities. And that kind of leads me to one of the things that I'm constantly finding myself promoting, and that is that maybe rather than initially focusing on individuals and their rebuilding and whether or not they should be rebuilding the house they just lost as they're sifting through their photographs, which is a really difficult time to be doing that. Let's look at ourselves first. Let's look at the investments that we, as the federal government, as state governments, and as localities are making in our infrastructure, and thinking about the longer term planning horizons and things like future risk being added to those types of investment decisions. And that is what I could say has been one of the big benefits of the Sandy Task Force and the activities that have been going on, is the federal families looking at ourselves, and we're saying, what should we be doing? What are the policies? What are the implementation mechanisms we should be putting in place for those types of planning activities? And I think that has been a success story.
Other thoughts on planning horizons and uncertainty? Okay. Next question is related to, in particular, Superstorm Sandy, that's provided a unique opportunity to take a look at how we rebuild, and the storm establishing sort of a new baseline. And the questions are how we will end up assessing how well we did after the next major event, and basically evaluating our approach to measuring coastal resilience and what kinds of indicators or benchmarks would be appropriate for that. It's an easy one, so who?
I'll jump in with just kind of a related issue, and it actually goes back to something we talked about, and that is that this idea of assessment and monitoring is such a huge one. And I will say, immediately after Hurricane Sandy, as the recovery group was kind of in there trying to build on what happened with the response activities to say what is needed to rebuild, we recognized that in a lot of cases, especially in the natural resources arena, we didn't have the monitoring, we didn't really have the assessment capabilities and the monitoring capabilities. And then as we started to think about playing that out in terms of recovery plans, what are the milestones? What are the benchmarks you're really looking for to say that from a federal standpoint and a state and local standpoint, what would we all agree is recovered? And I think having those, the earlier that we can be having those conversations, and the more closely that we can connect those to the systems that we have in place for assessing and monitoring not just the built environment but the natural environment as well, are going to be really critical. And I will say those are challenges that we need to think about in moving forward, because I don't believe we've addressed those.
I'll add that developing that is a milestone in the implementation plan, and whoever asked the question, if they want to find me afterwards, see if we can put our heads together and find out exactly what the place and page number is for you. We can go from there.
One thing too to think about, and this is what we're also wrestling with on the task force, is everyone's been saying rebuilding, rebuilding, rebuilding. Well, does it make sense to rebuild? I think that's also the biggest question that we have to ask ourselves. Yes, it makes sense to rebuild and to fortify, lower Manhattan when you have the financial capital of the world there. But does it make sense to do rebuilding where, where we found repeated damages to a natural ecosystem, and does it make sense for us to continue to do that? We have within our coastal storm damage reduction projects that the Corps of Engineers develops and designs, we have a 50-year life. When we authorize a beach and renourishment projects, that it's authorized for 50 years. So we have that 50-year planning horizon as far as what the renourishment cycle will be. It's based on the tides and the littoral drift and all of that when it's designed. But you get something like Superstorm Sandy, dropped in the middle of that, and there goes your whole, what you planned for. So you have to redo your renourishment cycle, and then that's what we have to. That's the sort of the planning horizon we have for those kinds of projects. But we didn't 50 years ago plan for something like this. So the best laid plans can often be, blown up in one serious storm event. So you have to be able to adapt, and adaptive management and as well as monitoring, I think, is going to be key to any kind of new way of looking at project design.
Well, here's an interesting question. The federal response to Sandy was impressive. Let's see, those responses. But those responses must have come at a cost to the daily routine activities of the agencies. So at the agency level, is there a calculation of what didn't get done because of the Sandy response, and how, and any things that didn't get done that could impact us in the next couple of budget cycles? Is anyone calculating this kind of at the administration-wide scale? How are we able to continue to muster this kind of a response in future events?
I'll just say that, I mean, we were funded through an emergency supplemental, as were many of the other agencies, for our actions. With the FEMA, when we did our responses that I described earlier, those are paid for by FEMA. The Corps of Engineers is reimbursed by FEMA, so our ongoing work, it's not taken from a project or something, it's reimbursed by FEMA. But the emergency supplemental, Sandy supplemental, was a direct, appropriation to each of the agencies, and it wasn't offset by taking money from other agencies. So, our work, I mean, we have response crews, that's part of what we have, and how we count on, the local, as far as responding. Our work continued on our regular daily basis, but we do have emergency response as part of our mission, and part of our funding.
Sandy, what did you leave back on your desk in Charleston when you?
I better say something, right? So there are costs to some of the agencies that participate, and in fact to all of them, I'm sure that you kind of absorb, at least initially, until you know what's going to be covered from a funding standpoint. And each agency is funded a little bit differently. I know in ours there were people who did have to drop things that they were working on already and continue to try to leverage programmatic funding that isn't supplemental funding. It's just part of what pays for us to do business, and trying to continue to leverage that to be part of the Sandy recovery activity. I will say that with a number of the agencies that I work with, I know I work really closely with USGS and Fish and Wildlife on some of the Sandy recovery activities, and what we're trying to do, again, is leverage those opportunities, leverage those research activities for longer term benefit, and to make sure that it gets incorporated into lessons learned for the future. So it's not just going to be concentrated in one geographic area, it's going to be part of how the federal system responds in the future. So.
I guess I'll just add that I'm really proud of our agency. Within 24 hours, we were able to account for every single employee. So we, from the time that the storm hits And it doesn't matter whether at that time, you don't care if you're getting money or not. You do what's right for your people. So we, right away, everybody, it was all hands-on. All our law enforcement was deployed. All our assets were deployed. And it didn't matter if it was going to the federal family or the state or the local. It was just, so there's a lot of disturbance when these things happen, and you just do what you need to do. There was quite a bit, there's still quite a bit of debris on a lot of our lands, and we're still trying to remove boats that were full of fuel, 35-foot boats. I couldn't believe how many brand new boats were up on our properties, just full of fuel, and how are we going to get those out? And I hope they don't leak, and there's barrels of unknown substance, so all of our contaminants biologists are out there. But everybody has a story like this, but every federal agency, I believe every entity, you get out there and you help each other, and then you figure out what you're going to do as a result. But there's a lot of work that doesn't get done, or at least the other types of work that don't get done as a result of responding to a natural catastrophe, but it's just what you need to do.
Okay, I think we have a little less than 5 minutes now, so I'll throw out one final question for you. What do you each see as the biggest barriers that we have left in terms of cross-agency collaboration and stakeholder engagement, but in particular this cooperation that we're seeing improvements in? Where do we need to improve the most right now going forward?
I guess, all right, so I'll jump in because then I'll be done first. So I was thinking earlier about, in terms of putting together the talking points on this, the sort of thinking about the title of this as, a new paradigm for, as if, we were minding our own business and then all of a sudden a new paradigm jumped out of the closet and it was there and it was for us to deal with. It's an evolution, right? And we're all learning the pieces to this as we go. So I guess, and part of this is informed by having come down from having been in a very different place and having to learn all of this, some of which, having to learn all of this. It takes a long time to change practice and behavior from established ways. And everybody's coming to this from the place where they work and where they've been, in many cases, doing this for a long time the same way and the same kind of approach. So while there is a recognition of new and extraordinary challenges and the need and the opportunity to address those in more responsive and better ways, that still has to be reconciled with human nature, OMB, agency, practice, and culture, and it's iterative, and it takes time to chew on this moving forward. So I think from my side of things anyway, it's coming back to that and recognizing that in moments of frustration when things aren't, the new paradigm isn't popping out of the closet and saying, hey, guess what, I'm done, I'm ready, right? It's we've made a small step here, and then looking for the opportunity to leverage that the next time through a wider sphere. And that's happening, but it's going to take time. And that dynamic is characterized across a number of realms, whether it's from senior agency leadership filtering down to folks in regions in the field who have been doing something a certain way for a very long time, or have different thoughts about the approach, whether it's the financial structure which informs the way an agency can behave, even as agency culture and their awareness is shifting, right? So lots of different stuff going on. Keeping at it, it's iterative. It's going to take a while to happen.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and also, it does take time, but also looking at the successes that you've had in doing it, right. And pointing to those and showing, how that collaboration worked and how it made something better, and also, we are. Routinely or oftentimes accused of being slow and taking so long. But if you are working with your federal family partners as well as people on the ground in the states, things can get done and get done more quickly, especially if you start early in talking. And we've been finding that in a lot of our planning processes now, and not just in disaster response, but in other things as well.
Kind of building on the OMB comment, that's actually a little voice that pops up in my head fairly frequently, because I think in the natural resources arena in particular, when we're working across agencies in a collaborative manner, the questions that come from OMB about, are you duplicating? Are you, why do you need to do so much cooperation? I mean, they do come up. As agencies, we have to address those on a pretty regular basis. So I think being able to tell the story of why this collaboration is necessary, why it takes multiple agencies to be able to work together to actually reduce some of the burden that ends up being taken on by the states and locals because of the lack of coordination, I think is an important story that we need to continue to tell.
And OMB, he said, shamelessly trying to cover himself for future recriminations, is a fantastic partner in these conversations.
Absolutely.
And I mean that sincerely.
They're a good voice to have in your head going, well, how do you do this? Yeah.
Well, I would just add that we would want to blow open those cylinders of excellence and join the pool of collaboratives. I mean, we need to be sharing information. We need to be talking. Relationships are everything. Those partnerships, knowing who is who on the ground in the various entities and agencies, and picking up that phone. And although we can do things quickly, it takes a little bit more time to do it right sometimes, and to really partner and make sure you're connecting, but that way you know you're doing it right. So taking the time to make sure all the right people are at the table and making decisions collectively really does get to a better outcome.
Great. Well, I think we are out of time, so let's thank the panelists. They were great discussions. Thank you.